to the ASCP 2020 annual meeting and our course, Implicit Bias, Maximizing Diversity and Minimizing Prejudices. I and the other faculty are all members of the ASCP Diversity and Inclusivity, and this session is co-sponsored by the ASCP Leadership Institute. Our faculty include me. I'm Melissa Upton. I'm an anatomic pathologist at University of Washington and immediate past president of ASCP. Dr. Loti Mulder directs the Leadership Institute as a staff member for ASCP and also on the Diversity and Inclusion Committee, as are all the rest of the faculty. Tiffany Channer is a medical laboratory specialist and the current chair of the Council for Laboratory Professionals. Dr. Von Samedi is an anatomic pathologist at University of Colorado, where he directs the residency program. And Dr. Susie is an anatomic pathologist who is the vice chair of her department at State University of New York at Stony Brook. None of us have any relevant financial relationships to disclose that relate to this presentation or content. What is implicit bias? Implicit bias are unconscious thoughts or feelings that we are not aware of. And when we have implicit bias, we have a preference for or against a person, a group, a behavior, rather than being neutral toward it. These describe attitudes toward people or association of stereotypes with people without our conscious knowledge. Another important concept is intersectionality. When we look at certain individuals, they have aspects of their background or personality that overlap and add together to increase the discrimination or bias they may face toward others. For instance, some of us are members of multiple groups. If you look at my intersectionality, for instance, I'm a woman, I'm over 70, and I grew up in East Tennessee. Some people have a lot of stereotypes about a person with these backgrounds, so it might be surprising for people to know how passionate I am about equity, diversity, and inclusion. Implicit bias training is not about shame and blame. This is why we're doing this course. This is about gaining self-awareness of the cultural prism with which we approach the world. And I'm going to talk about the way intrinsic bias can actually affect social choices and behaviors around large events. So look at the right on the screen. This is Hurricane Katrina bearing down on New Orleans about 15 years ago. The evacuation order came less than 24 hours before landfall. More than a quarter of the population lived below the poverty line, and more than a quarter of the population had no access to a private vehicle with which to evacuate. In addition, one-third of the population of New Orleans many of them lived in areas that had traditionally been redlined or zoned for Black ownership, and these were in areas that were particularly prone to flooding. If we look at this image of the Ninth Ward several days after the storm, we can see the consequences of the flooding in these susceptible zones. And the residents who stayed in their neighborhoods waited as long as 3 days to be rescued. Young men trying to obtain food and water to help their neighbors were labeled as looters by the national media. More than 100,000 people were displaced from their homes. Some have not yet been rebuilt. Some of the homes have never been rebuilt. And so the national media labeled the people who were flooded out as refugees, a label of otherness, rather than discussing them as American citizens. More recently, the events around COVID-19 are particularly poignant with respect to institutionalized biases. The assumption that there would be drive-up testing assumes that people have access to a car and don't rely on public transportation, or that they can easily get to a test site, which is not the case if they're in a rural area, for instance. Information provided assumes that people have access to radio, TV, or internet, or that people can read and understand English. The assumption that people could stockpile food or hand sanitizer assumes that people have the funds to do that or access to transportation to carry large amounts of food home. And our current healthcare system is based on certain intrinsic biases because we do not have point-of-care testing at work sites, in at-risk neighborhoods, or on reservations that serve Indigenous people. I will now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Mulder.
Thank you, Dr. Upton. So the definition of implicit bias is, as you can see on the slide, that the unconscious stereotypes that attribute specific qualities to a member of a certain group that impact our decisions, actions, and understanding of the person and the situation. However, there's one important aspect to understand when it comes to implicit bias. Implicit bias can often run counter to people's conscious expressed beliefs. For example, there are very few physicians who espouse racially discriminatory views, and yet doctors tend to recommend less pain medication for Black patients than for white patients with the identical injury. So in other words, people can be explicitly unbiased, but implicitly biased. At the bottom of this slide, you see a few different terms that are similar to implicit bias. They're just different ways of people who are stating it. So implicit bias is also known as unconscious bias, implicit social cognition, implicit stereotype, and unconscious attributions. An important aspect of implicit bias are the self-biases that we have. So those are our perceptions of ourselves, both positive and negative. Self-biases can prevent you from seeking feedback. They can make you content with how things are, even if the self-bias is negative, and it can also cause externalization of problems, meaning that we're blaming others or situations for current events. An example of such a self-bias is with job applications, where men tend to apply when they meet only about 60% of the qualifications, but most women apply only if they meet 100% of the qualifications. So this clearly shows the impact that self-bias can have on our career and then, of course, also on our personal life as well. Even though biases cannot be eliminated, there's a lot of things that we can actually do. The main thing is to increase our own self-awareness, which is one of the reasons why we have courses such as these, to not only make us understand the concept and the impact of implicit biases, but also to increase our awareness of the own biases that we may have. Once we have the awareness of our own biases, we can then change those biases. We can make sure that we can either reduce the biases that we have, we can reduce the stereotypes that we intrinsically believe, but we can also make sure that we no longer act upon them. Exposure is another way in order to increase our implicit biases. An example of how exposure can reduce them is there's this famous chef who liked all the foods except 6 different things. 3 of those things were clams, kimchi, and lard. After the 10th portion of kimchi that he ate, he started to really love it. He really went out of his way to make sure that within 6 months, he wanted to like all the foods that he didn't like, all those 6 foods. And after trying kimchi in multiple different locations and in multiple restaurants and different types, he really started to enjoy it and he understood the nuances of kimchi. And this is a simple example of how exposure to certain things can really reduce our biases. Additionally, being open-minded and not being stuck in your behaviors, thoughts, and emotions is, of course, always a good solution to any problem you encounter, including with biases. Being open towards people creates a space for learning and appreciation and understanding. And once we put those at the forefront, our biases will automatically take a step back towards the background. So along similar lines, taking a learning stance can also help. We can take a learning stance in terms of, through reading books, through traveling, through watching movies, through involving ourselves with people who are different than ourselves. the more we expose ourselves, the more open-minded we are, the more we increase our self-awareness, we can change the impact that our biases have on our thoughts, beliefs, and actions. So how does implicit bias differ from racism, sexism, and overall intolerance of others? There's clearly an overlap between all of these concepts. The most important thing to be aware of here is that racism, sexism, and intolerance of others can also be explicit. People can be aware of them and can and realize the impact that they have on others and still not change their mind, versus implicit bias is unconscious. So again, this is why we're having sessions such as these, to really make them more conscious on our part so that we can reduce and eliminate them to a certain degree. I also want to talk to you a little bit about microaggressions because it's an important aspect of implicit bias. Microaggressions are the indirect, subtle, and or unintentional discriminations. The reason why micro here is within brackets is because even though they are called microaggressions, they can actually feel very aggressive and not micro at all on the receiving end. So that's why it is important to be aware of those as well. Now there are three types of microaggressions, as you can see here. You have micro-assaults, which are explicit derogations, micro-insults, which are rude, insensitive, and demeaning communications, and micro-invalidations. And those are comments that exclude, negate, or nullify thoughts, feelings, or the reality of a person. Here we have some examples of microaggressions. On the left, they're example statements of what may be perceived as a microaggression, and on the right is how people on the receiving end may receive or hear what you're saying. If you're asking, where are you really from? The person who's receiving that question might hear, you are not American, or wherever you are in that moment. You speak good English might be perceived as you are a foreigner. You are so articulate might be perceived as it is unusual for someone of your race to be articulate or intelligent. There's only one race, the human race, could be perceived as denying the other person as a cultural being. I'm not racist, I have several black friends, could be perceived as that you are immune to racism because you have friends of color, and everyone can succeed in this society as long as they work hard enough. And this can be perceived as denying that opportunities are not equal. So one of the reasons why we talk about implicit bias is because of how important it is to create diverse and inclusive workforces. You can see some of the benefits of creating such workforces here on this slide. It creates a more qualified workforce. Such workforces represent the diversity of the society, so now you're representing the society as a whole within your organization. It helps reduce employee turnover. It fosters creativity and innovation, two things that every organization wants, and it also drives economic growth. In fact, employees who feel their voices heard at work are nearly 5 times more likely to feel empowered to perform their best work. And this is, of course, the environment that we want for all employees everywhere. Finally, I wanted to share the implicit bias assessment link. This is a free assessment tool that you can take that indicates if you are biased and who you are biased against and for. So if you want to copy the link, we highly recommend taking this test. It is very informative. And again, reducing your implicit bias all starts with self-awareness. So this is a great way to begin. And now I will turn it over to Ms. Tiffany Channer.
Hello, everyone. My intersectionality are 3 that are listed here. I am a Black woman. I'm from the Bronx, New York, and I am a technologist. Those 3 aspects of myself can definitely have implicit biases. As you're going to go through my side of the presentation, we're going to speak about healthcare and focus on implicit biases towards the laboratory profession. So I broke it down into different categories, different positions within the laboratory. The first one we're going to focus on is I am a phlebotomist. So basically, many people, unfortunately, think that they're the first people to actually see a patient, and they get the actual blood drawn, and that specimen is then taken to the lab. It all begins with them. They're essential. That's where it starts. Unfortunately, many people think that they're non-professional, and it's not rocket science to draw blood, which is not right at all. Next, I'm a medical technologist. Many times we have heard, me myself, I've even heard, oh, you're a lab tech, you're an introvert, and it comes with a tone of inferiority and negative body language, which is not right at all. And of course, we have, as a laboratory supervisor, a manager, or a director, you'll hear things like, if I complain, then I'll get my way, which is not the case. Oh, here comes the lab police. Or as a pathologist, oh, a doctor who never sees patients. These are all negative implicit biases that reside out there. So I just did it coming from the medical industry departments within health institutions towards the laboratory, and now I'm going to do the reverse. In doing the reverse, let's think of a nurse. Many people say, oh, OPOS, ONEG, same thing, doesn't mean anything, that nurses have these perceptions, which may not be true at all. Or as a physician, oh, finally you returned my page. Many medical technologists will tell you, oh, that is definitely a struggle for us, especially with criticals. They take a while to return the page, which can lead to someone being frustrated. Now, I'm actually about to tell you a situation that actually happened to me. So you see this picture here, I'm actually in scrubs. At the time, I was at another institution, and I was a supervisor / lead tech. Any individual that has been in such position will tell you it's a very tough position because you're kind of two people. So one day, dressed as you see in scrubs, I had two nurses actually come down to the laboratory, and they were just upset. Burst into my lab looking for the person that was working in hematology. That person wasn't there. I saw them, and I approached the nurses, and I asked them, is there anything that I could help you with? One nurse in particular looked at me with disdain. She looked at me up and down like I was not supposed to be there. I asked the question one more time, is there something that I can help you with? And she sees my badge and sees my title, and then she proceeds to speak to me. She says to me that the tech informed her that there was a mislabel on a specimen, and she wants to discuss it. I said to her, well, the tech is not here right now, so I'll take down your information, I'll do my investigation, and I will get back to you. Well, that wasn't suffice for her, so she continued to just stay there, and I reiterated the same thing that I said, I will get back to you with my findings. She finally went back to the ER. When the tech came back, the tech actually stepped out to use the restroom, and when she returned, I asked her about the situation. She said to me, Tiffany, there are two samples that came about 10 minutes apart with the same label. They had the same patient information. She ran them, and the results were not the same. So I said to her, and usually during these times, of course, blood bank is the one, hopefully, that can help us out. So I had both tube types, and one was an APOS, and the other was an O-neg. So clearly it was a mislabel. When I went back to the ER to discuss the situation, the nurse said to me, oh, I came back and I did some more investigating, and you can just discard those results. And, I redrew the patient and all is well. And I said to her, well, thank you for redrawing the patient and putting the order in. However, this is an incident report and I have to write it up because these are two different patients. They were typed and they're different types. So, of course, she was upset, but I got her information and I wrote up the case. It just goes to show that, we as a team, we have to work as a team. And if we basically make sure that everybody knows what our job is and what we do for healthcare, I think that this will be related much easier. So when we talk about diversity and inclusion, education is number one. So during onboarding, I think that's when it needs to be brought up. At the beginning, when you start a position, you need to know about the diversity and the inclusivity within the institution. Also during orientation presentations. So I remember I worked at another institution where the lab actually went down to orientation and we taught the new employees about the lab itself, where we said how many tests we actually did and how many accreditations that we have and things of that nature. And many people knew about, the laboratory and how significant we were. And now I'd like to introduce Dr. Vaughn Samedi.
Thank you, Tiffany, and thank you for all of us for joining us on such an important topic and issue that's impacting not just our field, but our society in general. In light of what is going on in society and the social climate that we live in, there's an acute need for sustained discussion, continued dialogue, and on how implicit biases are affecting all of our lives and what we can do about it. So my name is Vaughn Samedi, and my intersectionality is being a Black man and also an immigrant from Haiti. I just want to briefly give you some background information about Black immigrant in the United States. From 1980 to 2016, there's been about five-fold increase in the population of Black immigrants, from about 800,000 to above 4 million. And currently, 1 in 10 Blacks in the United States are foreign-born. And compared with other immigrants group, Blacks are more likely to be proficient in English, 74 to 51%, and Black immigrants are less likely, though, than the overall U.S. population to have a college degree, 28 versus 31%. And when we look at birthplaces of Black immigrants in the United States, Jamaica, Haiti, where I'm from originally, and Nigeria are the top 3 countries. In the U.S., 29% of physicians were born outside the U.S. And so immigrants contribute fairly to the healthcare delivery of this country. And about 5% of those foreign-born physicians are from Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean. Going back to my intersectionality, I wanted to bring attention to how someone with my intersectionality can be negatively impacted and disadvantaged by potential inherent biases associated with being Black and immigrant. There was the recent killing of George Floyd and the disproportionate impact of the pandemic in minority population. This certainly have highlighted many of the structural biases impacting Black and brown people. Black and African Americans suffer from healthcare disparity, economic financial disadvantages, decreased employment opportunities, some educational barriers, housing discrimination in some cases, voter suppression, to name a few. And while the U.S. is primarily a nation of immigrants, biases and discrimination against newcomers have always existed in this country. Immigrant can be perceived as taking employment that would have gone to U.S. citizens, and often seen as them, the others, you people, And beyond the color of our skin, having an accent like me automatically places you on this category of others. So being a Black immigrant comes with some negative, but there's also some pluses as well. The negative, obviously, I inherited automatically the biases and discrimination against African American. I am perceived as a non-deserving, non-American, taking the spot of a deserving American in some quarters. The positive is that I'm benefiting as well from the progresses and struggle of African American. And also being born and raised from a minority majority country, it gives me a different perspective and allows me to be free of some limitation, not all. In the next 4 slides, I want to share some data from Dr. White's paper, in which the authors look at the historical and current gender, racial, and ethnic diversity trend within the U.S. pathology graduate medical education and the pathology workforce as a whole. So in this graph, orange is Hispanic, blue is Black, and the Black is American Indian, Alaska Native, Native Hawaiian, Pacific Islanders. And you can see from medical school graduate to practicing pathologists and pathology faculty, underrepresentation is very acute. Now, one of those groups match their representation in the general society. And that's true for Hispanic, Black, and Native American. And that's from the 2017-2018. Now, if you look back, you see that nothing has really changed over the past over a 22-year period, looking from 1995 all the way to 2017. There's no significant trend in the rate of change per year in underrepresented minority pathology resident representation. And here on top is, you can see the purple is white, green is Asian, and everybody else is on the bottom. Nothing has really changed over those 22-year period. And if we look more at faculty by race and ethnicity, the underrepresentation of minority group remain constant as well over 4 decades. The top is white, this is Asian, and the bottom is all the underrepresented minority, which includes Black, Hispanic, and all Native Americans. Now, and when you're looking at female and underrepresented minority, there has been much progress for women in pathology. And for example, if you look at women in representation in the pathology workforce, about half, 50%, they make up 50% of the workforce. And also in dermatology, up to 60%. However, the underrepresentation of minority is seen across all specialties. So I think this data provide concrete evidence of the sustained underrepresentation of minority in the field of pathology. And recognizing these disparities should invite all of us to examine how the implicit biases may be contributing to this underrepresentation, and whether it's from recruitment all the way to retention. So now I want to pass it to Dr. Z.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to share some of my life experiences with you. I had polio when I was 1 year old in Hong Kong and used braces to get around until I was about 13 years old. I did not attend school in Hong Kong, and there was no law 40 years ago requiring disabled children to attend school. I had a private tutor once a week. So when we immigrated to the United States, the school called my father to find out why are there only 2 kids enrolled in school when he said there were 4. He was not aware that the United States Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 was in effect to protect disabled children. Schools getting federal funding were at that time and are now also required to accommodate children with disabilities for equal access to education. So for the very first day of school, it was pretty much a shock for me as a fourth grader without knowing a word of English. But I was a fast learner, and I made it to junior high. So junior high school was a little challenging in terms of getting around. They did not have an elevator, so I had to go up and down the flights of stairs, helped by teachers, the custodian, or anybody who was around. The same thing happened to me in high school. So it was a miracle that I never had an accident. So these kinds of physical barriers that were a constant throughout my journey through college, medical school, and residency, and in life in general. The physical accommodations that are getting better now after the passage of the American with Disabilities Act of 1990. This year marks the 30th anniversary of the ADA, and there is still much to do. As passing a law is one step, but enforcing the law to ensure access requires additional vigilance, advocacy, and awareness. I was very fortunate when I was accepted in medical school. They took a chance on me since they had never matriculated anyone who uses a wheelchair. Because of the fact that they had no experience dealing with a student with a physical disability, it was baptism by fire on their part as well as for me. During clinical collection rotations, I had to endure physical and attitudinal barriers. The latter were harder to take because some were outright explicit and aggressive. The head of the OBGYN clerkship threatened to fail me because I was physically unable to deliver a baby on my own. This was said not to my face, but to my rotation preceptor in the Queen's Hospital that I was rotating to. I can understand that if you are unable to deliver babies as an OBGYN resident, that would be quite unacceptable. However, I was a medical student and I was there for 7 weeks to experience OBGYN. And I saw, even now, I saw more and more regulations in medical schools that prevent more hands-on experience of medical students. I could see that the OBGYN rotation preceptor was embarrassed to have to relay this attitude of the clerkship director to me. The preceptor was very supportive, but eventually had to appease the head of the OBGYN department by reducing my grade from a high pass instead of honors. Interestingly, during medical school, there seems to be more conflict with physicians than with patients. So I don't recall any patients doubting my abilities or performance as a medical student because of my disability. Maybe my medical student status did not pose a threat to them. Physicians, on the other hand, had a hard time accepting my disability and focused on my limitations. During my pathology residency, I had a motorized scooter that elevated me to a height that made it easy for me to perform autopsies and gross specimens. Attitudinal barrier seems less menacing. Maybe this also reflects the perception that because I had a medical degree, I must have some capabilities despite my disability. Again, without having anyone preceding me before me, being the first wheelchair user in my pathology program was reinventing the wheel all over again with different cog designs. Explicit bias tends to be more prominent towards people with disability, and it does contribute to unconscious biases as well. I was taking a Chinese language course at Columbia in a building with a frequently broken elevator. The professor was asked to move to another classroom. She refused and threatened to quit before she had to move. She told the officer of the disability office that because I was Asian and disabled, I shouldn't even be in school. So the teacher was Asian herself. So as you know, I mean, the stereotypical Asian are hardworking and strive to be excellent. But when look at physical disabilities, a physically disabled person is stigmatized and perceived as defective, lacking worth, and incompetent. They're often neglected and not given the opportunity to demonstrate their capabilities. I eventually had to drop the course. To have a mentor was very pivotal in my growth and career. I was introduced to a pathologist in medical school who did clinical work, teaching, and basic science, and who was also a mother raising 2 kids. I spent 8 months in a laboratory studying HPV. So she became a role model that I strive to be. Her accomplishments were a reality, and having seen another individual's succeed, you can believe in the possibilities for yourself. Mentorship is so valuable and can alter one's destiny. She was a major influencer in my decision in becoming a pathologist. Not having a mentor or a role model with a disability was different on several levels. When I went to medical school, there was no Google, there was no internet, etc. Limitation in how to navigate through able-bodied society is often difficult without guidance. For example, before my clinical rotations in medical school, I was able to learn from a hematologist at an NYU City Hospital who was a wheelchair user. She showed me how to examine a patient by bedside. And that was the only opportunity I had to learn from a person with similar situation. After I graduated, at least 2 other disabled physicians graduated from my medical school. I hope that in some way my success in completing medical school had positively contributed to the school's willingness to accept students with disability. I was well aware that disclosing my disability in medical school applications were risky. 30 years ago, a physical disability, especially a person in a wheelchair, would be an automatic rejection. Unfortunately, I'm not so sure that this is not true today. In our society, implicit bias toward people with disability is influenced more by their physical appearance. And as the belief that someone with a leg amputation can be made whole again with a prosthesis is a big reason why big insurance companies will reimburse a prosthetic leg, which can cost from $10,000 to $50,000. But they will not reimburse or cover a lightweight custom-made wheelchair. A person in a wheelchair is seen as less than whole, with physical limitations and cannot be made whole. So why would one need an $8,000 custom-made wheelchair? The truth is that a custom-made wheelchair made a world of difference to me and others like me who have an active lifestyle. So you ask, well, how could somebody in a wheelchair be active? Well, there are very different custom-made wheelchairs out there, of course not reimbursed by medical insurance, that allow disabled people to ski, play rugby, play hockey, and also road racing and playing tennis. So as someone, me, who married a para-Olympian, I was introduced to the disabled community that I never known when I was growing up. I became involved in road racing and wheelchair tennis. Again, I'm going back to the importance of having a role model that could open up. And I think that, having a role model mentor can open up possibilities that may not be evident. So as a vice chair for anatomic pathology in my current institution, I have been able to overcome adversaries and adversities along the way to achieve success despite my disability. I stand by the motto, when there's a will, there's a way. Given the opportunity of mentorship, I was able to achieve my dreams. My intersectability is multifaceted, and I hope that being visible and out there, I could serve as a role model to people with disabilities. In closing, I hope you realize that looks can be deceiving, and first impression may trigger your implicit biases. Look deeper, and please recognize the enormous potential that you might overlook if you follow your first impression and unconscious biases. Thank you.
Thank you very much. In conclusion, I hope that you have enjoyed our presentation today, and I'd like to encourage you, what are the things you can do to address your own intrinsic biases? One is common identity formation. What do you have in common with the individual whom you are encountering? Maybe you both love sports. Maybe you both enjoy listening to the same kind of music. Take perspective. Put yourself in the other person's shoes. Think about what it took them to get to this appointment or to this position, and relate on a human level. Consider the opposite. If you have a particular conclusion about an individual, play the internal debater and look at that individual or that situation from the completely opposite perspective. And also counter stereotypical thinking. O.T. Mulder has also already spoken about the importance of reading and learning about groups, and also looking for heroes from a group that you may or may not know about. These suggestions were made by Dr. Quinn Capers IV. He's the current Dean of Admissions at Ohio State, and he has managed in a short period of time in his leadership position to greatly increase the diversity of the entering medical school classes at Ohio State with no decrement in the quality of the background and performance of the students. So we hope that you've enjoyed our presentation. We hope that you will reach out to any of us about activities that you can engage with us on in our diversity and inclusion efforts in ASCP. We hope you will take implicit bias training, and we hope that you will share your